For the first time in 7 years, the United States has lost access to the world's largest agricultural export market, at the exact moment its harvest reaches peak volume. China, which once purchased nearly half of all American soybean exports, recorded zero imports from the United States in September, even as its overall soybean purchases reached the second highest monthly total on record, at 12.87 million metric tons. This isn't a temporary disruption caused by logistics or seasonal timing. It's a calculated redirection of one of the most strategic commodity flows in global agriculture, happening while American farmers store record volumes in silos with no immediate buyers. The shift occurred quietly, without dramatic announcements or policy declarations, but its implications extend far beyond this year's harvest. What's unfolding now could permanently reshape who controls food supply leverage in the 21st century. And the United States may be discovering that the position it once held is no longer guaranteed. For decades, the US-China soybean relationship functioned as one of the most stable and predictable trade flows in global agriculture. American farmers, particularly those across the Midwest heartland in Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, structured their entire planting and financing decisions around Chinese demand. China's feed mills required massive volumes of soybeans to support the world's largest livestock industry, and American producers could deliver those volumes with reliability, quality, and competitive pricing. At its peak in 2024, China purchased nearly 27 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans annually. This represented more than half of all American soybean exports and provided critical revenue that sustained rural economies across multiple states. The system worked because both sides benefited. China secured stable food supplies for its growing population, and American farmers gained access to a market so large that no other destination could replace it. The rhythm was predictable. Combines rolled across fields each September. Soybeans moved down rivers to Gulf Coast ports, and vessels departed for China throughout the fall and winter months. That rhythm has now stopped entirely. The halt began during the current trade confrontation between Washington and Beijing, which escalated through a series of reciprocal tariff actions. The United States announced a new 100% tariff on certain Chinese imports, bringing total duties on some goods to 130%. China responded by targeting American agricultural products, specifically soybeans, as a strategic pressure point. In September, as the American autumn harvest began, China's imports from the United States fell to zero, a stark contrast to the 1.7 million metric tons shipped during the same month the previous year. President Trump, speaking aboard Air Force One, called the halt an economically hostile act and stated he would only consider reducing tariffs on Chinese goods if Beijing resumed buying U.S. soybeans and made other concessions, including ending export restrictions on rare earth minerals. He warned that no deal would be made unless China agreed to resume soybean purchases at previous levels. Chinese officials, meanwhile, appear to be using soybean trade as a deliberate negotiating tool, a low-cost method of applying pressure ahead of expected high-level diplomatic meetings. The scale of China's pivot away from American soybeans becomes clear when examining the numbers. In September, China imported 12.87 million metric tons of soybeans total, maintaining elevated overall demand. Brazilian shipments rose 29.9% year-over-year to 10.96 million tons, accounting for 85.2% of China's total imports for that month. Argentina's deliveries jumped 91.5% to 1.17 million tons, representing 9% of the total. For the January through September period, China imported 63.7 million tons from Brazil, up 2.4% year-over-year, and 2.9 million tons from Argentina, up 31.8%. Brazil set a record with 2.474 billion bushels shipped to China between January and August, with Brazilian soybeans accounting for approximately 93% of China's total soybean imports this year to date. The United States Department of Agriculture projects that U.S. agricultural exports to China will total $17 billion in 2025, down 30% from 2024 and more than 50% from 2022. For 2026, exports are expected to fall further to just $9 billion, the lowest level since the 2018 trade war. China has not purchased any U.S. corn, wheat, or sorghum this year, and pork and cotton exports continue only at reduced levels. The absence of Chinese buyers has created immediate financial strain across American agricultural regions. Farmers who typically sell their harvest directly after combining are now storing soybeans in on-farm bins with no confirmed purchase agreements. One Illinois farmer explained that normally, soybeans would move immediately from combines to river systems, then down to Louisiana ports for export to China. This year, they're going directly into storage. The financial consequences are severe. As of June, farm bankruptcies had surged 55% compared to the previous year-to-year period. Farmers face a situation where they've invested in planting, fertilizer, equipment, and labor to produce one of the largest crops in history. Yet they're forced to sell at steep losses or hold inventory indefinitely. Fixed costs continue accumulating: tractors, combines, fuel, maintenance, while revenue remains uncertain. Rural equipment dealers have reported a 30% increase in farm machinery being sold at auction as operators liquidate assets to maintain cash flow. Manufacturing is affected as well. John Deere, a major U.S. agricultural equipment manufacturer, announced that U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum would cost the company $600 million in 2025, contributing to layoffs of 2,500 workers over the past 2 years. The ripple effects extend into small towns and local economies that depend on agricultural spending. China's ability to maintain record soybean import volumes while completely eliminating U.S. purchases reveals the strategic restructuring of global agricultural supply chains that began during the 2017 to 2018 trade tensions and has now accelerated dramatically. Brazil has invested heavily in expanding soybean production capacity, with the national supply company projecting Brazilian soybean acreage will increase by 3.5% to reach 121 million acres, the largest area on record. For comparison, U.S. farmers planted 81 million acres of soybeans in the current crop season. Chinese state-owned companies have invested directly in Brazilian port infrastructure, including facilities at Paranaguá, Açu, and Santos, ensuring steady throughput for their purchases. This infrastructure investment creates long-term supply reliability that doesn't depend on U.S. political stability. The timing also works in Brazil's favor. Its harvest season occurs during the early months of the calendar year, when its soybeans are cheaper, while U.S. exports typically peak later in the year. China maintains a 13% tariff on U.S. soybeans, making American products significantly more expensive than South American alternatives, even if political tensions ease. Beyond soybeans, China is exploring ways to reduce overall dependence on imported feed through domestic policy changes, with pilot programs in several provinces testing lower soybean meal content in livestock rations. The leverage structure in this confrontation has shifted in ways that challenge conventional assumptions about agricultural trade. China demonstrated it can maintain food security while completely bypassing American producers, revealing that the United States is more dependent on Chinese demand than China is on U.S. supply. There is no single country or market capable of absorbing the volume China once purchased from American farmers. Japan has expressed willingness to increase agricultural trade, but analysts note that demand outside China is limited in the short run. Long-term market development takes years and doesn't provide immediate relief. The American Soybean Association points out that even if Brazil experiences harvest delays early in 2026, creating a potential supply crunch, Chinese purchases of U.S. soybeans would likely be minimal based on the high volume of South American purchases already secured and the capacity of China's state reserves. Meanwhile, American farmers face impossible planning decisions. If trade doesn't resume and soybean prices remain depressed, many will shift to planting corn next spring. Agricultural economists warn that 2 consecutive years of oversized corn crops would create severely depressed corn prices by fall 2026, potentially triggering a cascading financial crisis across multiple commodity sectors simultaneously. What appears to be a dispute over soybeans is actually a test case for strategic commodity dependence in an era of geopolitical competition. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that its agricultural productivity gave it permanent leverage, that countries dependent on American food supplies would moderate their political positions to maintain access. China has now demonstrated that this assumption no longer holds. Beijing has successfully diversified its agricultural supply chains to the point where it can apply political pressure by withholding purchases rather than by threatening embargoes. This reversal of leverage extends beyond agriculture. The same dynamic is emerging in rare earth minerals, advanced manufacturing components, and critical technology inputs. The White House announced that China would purchase 12 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans by the end of the calendar year, with 25 million metric tons annually for the next 3 years. However, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer later clarified there was a discrepancy between the White House fact sheet and the actual deadline, stating the commitment was for the growing season rather than the calendar year. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested the deadline might extend to February 28th. His confusion over timelines signals either miscommunication or deliberate ambiguity, neither of which inspires confidence in enforcement mechanisms. China has yet to confirm these purchase commitments publicly. Several analysts predict China may begin purchasing U.S. soybeans in January, with some estimates suggesting shipments could reach 8.5 million metric tons for the marketing year 2025 to 2026. However, this would still represent a fraction of historical volumes and would depend entirely on Brazilian supply being consumed and Chinese reserves being drawn down. The American Farm Bureau Federation projects that even if purchases resume, they won't return to pre-trade war levels. In a recent survey, 88% of agricultural economists responded that they do not believe U.S. agricultural exports to China will return to 2017 levels in the future. Brazil is already planting its 2025 to 2026 crop, with expectations for another record in soybean acreage. As long as Brazil continues expanding production and Chinese infrastructure investments in Brazilian ports continue functioning efficiently, the structural conditions favoring South American supply over American supply will persist. Agricultural economists note that Brazil has become a more reliable source for soybeans, precisely because its supply isn't subject to unpredictable political disruptions. One economist stated that China is making a calculated move to limit its dependence on the United States, explaining that if Chinese leaders view Washington as a strategic threat, they have the resources to pay slightly more for Brazilian soybeans or draw down state reserves. It's about control and national leverage, not simply about obtaining the cheapest beans. Once agricultural trade routes shift and new supply relationships become established, reversing them becomes extremely difficult. Contracts, infrastructure investments, financing arrangements, and logistical systems all align around new pathways. Chinese feed mills that have spent 2 years developing relationships with Brazilian suppliers and optimizing logistics around South American delivery schedules won't casually abandon those arrangements even if U.S. prices drop. The port investments Chinese state-owned companies made in Brazil represent sunk costs that create incentives to maintain those supply channels. American farmers face a parallel irreversibility. Those who shift from soybeans to corn or other crops in 2026 to avoid planting for a non-existent market won't instantly return to soybeans if Chinese demand eventually resumes at reduced levels. Equipment, land preparation, financing, and crop insurance all require advanced planning. The financial damage already inflicted, bankruptcies, asset liquidations, generational farm transitions abandoned, cannot be undone by future trade agreements. The infrastructure of rural America, including the small-town economies that depend on agricultural prosperity, operates on thin margins. Once businesses close, workers relocate, and support networks collapse, rebuilding takes decades, not seasons. Brazil, meanwhile, continues expanding. The projection that Brazilian soybean acreage will reach 121 million acres, compared to 81 million in the United States, represents a structural capacity shift that creates permanent competitive advantage regardless of short-term political agreements. The soybean halt reveals a broader pattern emerging across multiple sectors: the erosion of U.S. leverage in strategic commodity relationships as other nations develop alternatives and reduce dependence. This isn't about agricultural policy alone. It's about what happens when geopolitical competition intersects with supply chain vulnerabilities. For decades, American policymakers operated under the belief that U.S. dominance in food production, energy resources, and critical technologies provided permanent negotiating advantages. But dominance only creates leverage when the other side lacks alternatives. China spent the past 7 years systematically building those alternatives. The same strategic logic applies to rare earth minerals, semiconductor supply chains, pharmaceutical ingredients, and advanced manufacturing inputs. Once a country demonstrates it can withstand disruption by activating alternative sources, the leverage calculation changes permanently. American farmers find themselves on the front line of this strategic recalibration, not because of agricultural policy specifically, but because their product became a testing ground for whether economic interdependence still constrains geopolitical competition. The answer appears to be no, or at least not in the ways previously assumed. The rural communities now facing financial crisis are experiencing the downstream consequences of strategic miscalculation at the national level, where policy decisions were made with incomplete understanding of who actually held positional advantage. The United States has lost access to the world's largest agricultural export market at the exact moment its harvest reaches peak volume, not because of crop failure or natural disaster, but because of a calculated strategic decision by the buyer. China demonstrated it could maintain food security while completely bypassing American producers, revealing that leverage in commodity relationships isn't permanent. It depends on alternatives, infrastructure, and willingness to absorb short-term costs for long-term positioning. American farmers are storing record volumes with no immediate buyers. Rural bankruptcy rates are surging, and agricultural economists overwhelmingly believe exports won't return to previous levels. Meanwhile, Brazil is expanding capacity. Chinese investments in South American infrastructure are solidifying new supply routes, and the timeline confusion surrounding purchase commitments suggests uncertainty about whether agreements will be enforced or honored. What began as a trade confrontation designed to pressure concessions has instead exposed which side had more options and which side had more concentrated dependence. The harvest season that should have been a period of reward has become a season of stored grain, mounting debt, and uncertain futures. The question isn't whether trade will eventually resume in some form. It likely will. The question is whether the position American agriculture once held can ever be fully recovered, or whether the past 2 years have permanently shifted the global balance of agricultural leverage toward producers and buyers willing to invest in alternatives. For those watching these developments, the implication is clear. In an era of geopolitical competition, even sectors that seem economically stable can become strategically expendable when the calculation changes about who needs whom more.